Early that morning, the heavy thud of a fist against my front door shattered the quiet of my home. I opened it to find a deputy sheriff holding a formal eviction notice with my name on it. Across the street, my own son-in-law leaned against a brand new Porsche, laughing and holding up his phone to record me. "Hurry up, old man," he shouted, his voice cutting through the crisp Georgia air. "This house is ours now." I did not yell. I did not panic. I calmly looked at the papers and asked the officer one single question. His face went instantly pale. "The name is Garrison Pruitt. 70 years old, a widower long retired from a career as a petroleum chief engineer and the deed holder to a 5-acre spread just beyond the Atlanta, Georgia city limits." It was a Tuesday morning. What I remember most clearly is the deep, dark aroma of the coffee I'd just pulled off the burner. Outside, the sun was barely edging up past the rooflines, bleeding across the suburban sky in long streaks of burnt orange and pale purple. The kind of morning my late wife and I would have claimed for ourselves, coffee on the porch. No agenda, just quiet. That quiet didn't last. It was shattered by heavy, insistent fists hammering against my door. I put my porcelain mug down on the granite counter and dried my calloused hands on a dish towel. Then I pulled open the heavy mahogany door, and there was Deputy Hobbs standing right on my welcome mat. "Welcome to Dad Revenge. Glad you're here with me today. If stories like this one speak to you, stay close and follow along so you never miss what's coming next. Before we go any further, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. When someone you love betrays your trust, is your first instinct to confront them head on, or to step back, stay quiet, and build your case in silence? Let me know below. A quick note before we continue: some details in this story have been shaped for the purpose of storytelling, and any resemblance to specific real individuals or events is purely coincidental. What matters is the truth at the heart of it. I knew Hobbs. He was a decent young man who'd grown up just a few miles down the road. But that morning, he wouldn't meet my eyes. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, a manila folder pressed tight against his chest. "Mr. Pruitt." His voice came out unusually clipped and formal. "I'm truly sorry to be the one doing this." He extended a thick stack of legal papers toward me. Bold black lettering across the top read "Court-ordered notice of eviction." I reached out and took it. The document felt weighted in my hands, not by paper, but by the depth of the betrayal folded inside it. I didn't rush to read the fine print. My gaze drifted past the deputy's shoulder out across the sprawling green lawn I'd spent 3 decades tending. Parked illegally over the curb across the street, half on the grass, sat a gleaming midnight black Porsche. Draped casually across its hood was Leland Crane, my 42-year-old son-in-law. He was dressed sharp, tailored suit, polished shoes every inch, the self-made startup entrepreneur he liked to perform for my friends. His phone was raised high, camera aimed straight at my front porch. He was laughing, a loud and cutting sound that floated across the quiet morning air without any effort at all. He wanted my humiliation on film. He wanted to watch my world collapse and share the footage. "Get your bags packed, old man," he called out across the pavement, grinning wide. "I told you your time was up." Standing right next to him, arms folded across her chest, was Nadia, my own daughter, the little girl I'd carried on my shoulders, the woman whose college tuition, lavish wedding, and every financial emergency in between I had quietly covered, never once asking for anything back. She wore a crisp white blazer, makeup perfectly set her face arranged into a cool and satisfied smirk. At 38, she worked as a real estate agent. She knew exactly how property law operated. She kept her eyes off mine, her focus fixed somewhere around my front steps, but the faint curl at the corner of her mouth told me what I needed to know. She wasn't a reluctant bystander. She was a willing architect of this moment, and she was savoring it. I looked down at the wooden planks beneath my feet. 30 years ago, I drove every nail into this porch myself. I spent whole weekends measuring, cutting, and sanding solid oak so that Nadia would have somewhere safe to play. I raised this house from nothing, built it to be a permanent shelter for my family. And now my own blood was standing across the street, waiting for officers of the law to drag me out, expecting me to go quietly, with nothing but my coat and maybe a bag. They were under the impression they had an old, helpless man with no way out. That was their catastrophic miscalculation. My entire professional life was spent managing massive offshore oil rigs. As chief engineer, I was accountable for billion-dollar operations conducted in the middle of an unforgiving ocean. Every day on that job meant reading complex structures, anticipating catastrophic failures, and neutralizing lethal risks before they could detonate. I am trained thoroughly, professionally, to identify structural weaknesses, whether those weaknesses exist in a deep-water drilling platform or in the character of greedy people standing on my lawn. Pressure doesn't make me crack. It makes me sharper. I observe, I calculate, I endure. And standing there watching the smug satisfaction on Leland's face and the cold set of Nadia's shoulders, I felt whatever remained of my fatherly warmth extinguish itself completely. The patient man who had bankrolled their lifestyle without complaint, the grieving widower who had swallowed his own pain to hold the family together, that man was finished. They wanted to play a ruthless game of corporate theft to turn the law into a weapon and strip me of everything. They had no idea they'd just sat down across the table from someone who plays that game for keeps. I turned back to Deputy Hobbs. He was barely breathing, bracing for the explosion, the shouting, the tears, the desperate pleading that usually came with a morning like this. I adjusted my glasses and quietly read through the first page of the notice. It stated plainly that the property had been foreclosed upon under the authority of Crane Holdings, Leland's primary corporate entity. A dry, soft chuckle escaped me. Hobbs blinked, visibly thrown by my composure. I tapped the page with my index finger and let the silence hold for one more beat. "Officer Hobbs," I said, my voice low and unhurried. "Before you go any further, I have one straightforward question." He gave a quick nod, his throat working as he swallowed. "Go ahead, Mr. Pruitt." I pointed to the official seal. "This eviction notice was filed by Crane Holdings claiming full ownership of my land. But are you aware that this entire 5-acre property was locked into an irrevocable blind trust back in 2017, selling it, transferring it, or using it as collateral? None of that is legally possible. Not for anyone, including me. So what I need you to explain is exactly what forged fraudulent document my son-in-law used to get past a federal judge and land you on my porch this morning." Hobbs went still. The color left his face so rapidly, I thought he might go down right there on the steps. His hand drifted away from his utility belt without him seeming to notice. In that fraction of a second, it registered he wasn't here enforcing a routine eviction. He had been pulled into a serious federal crime, and he was standing at the center of it. The young deputy swallowed hard, his eyes flicking between the manila folder in his grip and the smug figure of my son-in-law across the street. When he looked back at me, his uniform seemed to fit him differently, like it belonged to someone older and more certain. "Sir, I just process whatever the county clerk sends over," he said, his voice dropping to a shaky near whisper. The paperwork had a judge's signature. Everything appeared standard. I kept my posture easy and gave him a slow, measured nod. "I know that's your job, son," I said. "But standard paperwork doesn't reach inside an irrevocable blind trust. A judge would only sign an eviction order if someone submitted a deed proving legal transfer of ownership. Since that transfer cannot legally happen, whoever filed this committed perjury and put forged documents in front of a federal court." Hobbs looked back down at the folder, and his hands were visibly trembling now. He was a good kid. He understood exactly what I was laying out. If he moved forward and forced me from my home on the strength of fabricated corporate documents, he would be a participant in a federal felony. He stepped back from the doorway, putting some respectful distance between us. "Mr. Pruitt, what would you like me to do?" he asked, all trace of official authority gone from his voice. "Ellie, just hold on," I said quietly, settling my shoulder against the doorframe. "Don't call it in yet. Don't go near the vehicle across the street. Just stand here on the porch with me for a minute and let them believe they've already won." Hobbs nodded, angling his body away from the street, so Leland and Nadia couldn't read the alarm written across his face. Across the pavement, Leland still had his phone in the air, convinced he was filming the moment I fell apart. Nadia was leaning close to him, whispering something, a cruel little smile on her lips. They were certain they had pulled off something flawless, that they'd outmaneuvered a senile old man, too generous and trusting to see it coming. Watching my daughter celebrate my ruin from across the street, my thoughts pulled away from the morning cold. I needed to retrace it all, to remember precisely how this trap had been assembled. To grasp the full dimensions of what they'd done, you have to go back to where it actually began. This didn't spring from sudden cruelty. It was constructed carefully over time with tears and manipulation and a deliberate exploitation of a father's love. The groundwork was laid exactly 4 months earlier on a miserable rain-soaked Tuesday night in late November. I was settled into my worn wingback chair with an engineering journal when the doorbell started ringing in a panic. It was past midnight. I pulled open the door to find Nadia and Leland on the porch, drenched through and looking utterly hollowed out. Nadia was crying hard, mascara tracking down her face in dark lines. Leland stood beside her like a man who'd already lost everything and was only just realizing it. I brought them inside, got them dry towels, and put the kettle on. Leland dropped into a chair at the kitchen table and stared at his hands. His tech startup, he said, was days from total collapse. A former business partner had filed a malicious lawsuit against him, freezing every corporate asset he held. Legal bills were bleeding them out, and without a substantial emergency loan from the bank within the week, they'd lose their home and have nothing left. Nadia reached across the table and took hold of my hands. Her fingers were ice cold. She looked up at me with a desperation that cut straight through me. "Dad, please," she sobbed, her voice splintering. "We have nowhere else to go. The bank won't extend the loan because Leland's assets are frozen. They're requiring substantial collateral before they'll approve anything. If we can't get this money, we'll be out on the street. Mom always made you promise to look after me. Please don't let us lose everything." Hearing her pull her late mother into it landed like a fist against my ribs. My wife had been the very center of this family, and in her final hours, gripping my hand in that hospital bed, she had asked me to swear I would always watch over our daughter. Nadia knew precisely which wound to press. She understood that my grief had never fully healed, and she used it against me like a scalpel. I asked what they needed from me. I offered to cash out some mutual funds, give them a personal loan to get through the worst of it. Leland shook his head, dragging a hand through his damp hair. "Cash isn't going to fix this, Garrison," he said, his voice hollow with exhaustion. "The bank needs to see long-term appreciating collateral standing behind my corporate portfolio. We just need to temporarily park the management rights of this property under my holding company." I tensed up immediately. I told him I couldn't do that. This land was my foundation, my permanent ground. Leland was quick to walk it back, raising both hands in a gesture of reassurance. "No, Garrison, you're reading this wrong. We're not asking for ownership. What we're talking about is setting up a family limited liability company. It's standard practice for shielding inherited assets from estate taxes when you're gone. Management rights transfer to the LLC. It shows up on the books as managed equity. The bank sees the backing and approves the loan, and you eliminate a brutal future tax burden. You go right on living here. Nothing about your life changes." It was a convincing pitch. The American tax system is notoriously punishing on inherited wealth, and a family management entity is a routine vehicle for protecting what you've built over a lifetime. Leland spoke with the smooth, practiced fluency of a man who'd closed deals before. Nadia kept crying, her hands wrapped around mine, pleading with me to rescue her future. I looked at my daughter and saw the frightened little girl I'd spent decades protecting. I had no idea I was looking at a predator who had set a trap specifically for me. Against every instinct that was quietly firing, I agreed, told them to come back in the morning with the paperwork. I thought I was honoring my wife's last wish. I had no idea I'd just agreed to something that would cost me everything. The next day, Leland returned with a thick stack of documents and a notary who said almost nothing. I read the opening pages. They described the family corporation just as Leland had laid it out the night before. I signed. I never saw the lethal clause buried in the center of that pile. That was 4 months ago. Now I was standing on my porch with Deputy Hobbs watching Leland and Nadia wait across the street for me to be removed from my own home. The rain and the performance tears from that November night were a distant memory. I knew the truth now. There was never any family management company. There was never any plan to protect my legacy. What they needed was outright ownership, and they took it from under me without a moment's hesitation or remorse. I can still recall every detail of that midnight visit. The storm had been building all afternoon, rolling across the Georgia plains with a raw, restless force. Rain hammered the windows in sheets, and the low roll of thunder barely let up. I was settled in my worn wingback chair in the study working through a technical engineering journal under the warm spread of a desk lamp, the kind of solitary evening I'd always found steadying. Then the doorbell rang, frantic, insistent, wrong for that hour. Nobody comes to the door after midnight without a reason. I set the journal aside, a knot of real concern forming in my chest, and went to answer it. When I pulled it open, the wind drove rain across the hardwood floor. There on the porch, drenched and looking utterly broken, were Nadia and Leland. Nadia was shivering hard, her expensive coat soaked through mascara drawn down her cheeks in dark, uneven lines. Leland looked like he hadn't slept in days. Hair-plastered, flat eyes, red-rimmed and restless. I didn't start asking questions. My instincts as a father overrode everything else. I pulled them out of the rain, pushed the heavy mahogany door shut against the storm, and walked them straight to the kitchen. I got them dry towels from the laundry room and set the kettle going. The whole time Nadia kept crying, face buried in her hands, shoulders heaving with sobs that shook her entire frame. Leland sat at the head of the kitchen table, both hands wrapped around a steaming mug, like it was the only solid thing left in his world. He stared at the surface of the table, inhabiting the role of a broken man with remarkable commitment. I pulled out a chair across from him, watched Nadia press a paper towel against her eyes, and asked them quietly to tell me what had happened. Leland drew a long, unsteady breath and looked at me with eyes full of manufactured devastation. He explained that his technology startup was days from complete collapse. A former business partner, he said, had filed a sweeping, malicious lawsuit against the company. That lawsuit had triggered a legal injunction, locking every corporate account and personal asset he had. The legal fight to lift the injunction was draining whatever reserves remained. He laid out the full picture. If he couldn't secure a major corporate survival loan by the end of the week, the company would fold, their house would be gone, and they'd have nothing left standing. He was convincing. The financial language came easily, and he'd calibrated exactly how much vulnerability to show. I listened the way I'd listen to a pressure gauge reading on a rig, patiently absorbing the data, looking for the flaw. But before I could work through it logically, Nadia made her move. She reached across the wide table, her cold and still damp fingers locking around my hands. She looked me directly in the eyes, and whatever she'd arranged on her face looked entirely devastatingly genuine. "Son, Dad, please," she whispered, her voice fracturing in the quiet kitchen. "There is nowhere left for us to turn. Every door has been shut. The bank won't touch us while Leland's assets are tied up in court. We're going to lose the house. We'll have nothing." Then she delivered the blow she'd saved for last, the one she knew would reach past every rational defense I had left. "Mom always made you promise to protect me, Dad." The words came, soft tears moving freely down her face. "She made you swear you'd never let me fall. Please don't let us lose everything." Hearing her call up her mother's memory hit me the way only that kind of grief can. My wife had been the soul of this family. In her last days, her hand thin and cool in mine in that hospital room, she had looked at me and asked me to swear I would always be there for our daughter. Nadia knew exactly the weight that promise carried. She understood My grief was something that had never fully gone quiet, and she turned it into a weapon against me with cold, surgical precision. Whatever skepticism I had been quietly building got swamped by instinct. I looked at my weeping daughter and the apparently shattered man beside her. I told them to breathe. I wasn't going to let them lose their home. I offered to liquidate a meaningful portion of my mutual funds right away, write them a personal check, a substantial loan to carry them through until the lawsuit resolved and their accounts came free. But Leland shook his head again, rubbing a hand through his still damp hair. "Cash won't solve the structural problem, Garrison," he said, wearing his exhaustion like a costume. "The bank's examiners aren't looking for a temporary injection. They need to see long-term appreciating collateral standing behind the corporate portfolio. A real tangible asset on the books, that's what unlocks the funding that saves the company." My engineering instincts threw up a flag. I told him straight out that I wouldn't put this property up as collateral. This 5-acre estate was my permanent ground, the legacy I intended to leave behind. Leland immediately pulled back, palms up, projecting total reasonableness. "Garrison, I think you're misreading what we're asking," he said, keeping his voice low and patient. "We would never ask you to risk your home. What we're proposing is a family limited liability company, a completely standard financial arrangement." He laid it out smoothly. They'd just be parking the management rights of the property under his holding company on a temporary basis. He leaned in, dropping his voice into that register people use when they want to sound trustworthy. He framed it as a standard strategy to shield me from punishing estate taxes down the line. By moving management rights into the new corporate entity, the property would register as managed equity on his balance sheet. The bank would see solid backing approve his emergency loan, and as a bonus, I'd sidestep the death taxes that could cripple my estate. "You keep right on living here exactly as you always have," he said, holding my gaze steadily. "Nothing changes for you, but you save our lives in the process." It was a persuasive argument. The American tax system is notoriously brutal on inherited wealth, and a family management corporation is a widely accepted tool for sheltering generational assets. He delivered it all with the polished, confident vocabulary of a practiced businessman, legitimate fiscal strategy, used as a smokescreen for outright theft. I never spotted the sharp hook buried inside the plea. The very next morning, the storm had moved on and left behind a deceptively clear Georgia sky. I was at the kitchen counter pouring my first cup of black coffee when the heavy tires of Leland's leased SUV came crunching up the gravel drive. He hadn't come by himself. Beside him was a man he introduced as his corporate notary, a nervous, perspiring figure named Floyd, who had the look of someone who hadn't slept in several days. Floyd wore a rumpled beige suit that smelled faintly of stale coffee and discount aftershave. He pressed a thick leather briefcase against his chest, like it held something classified, his eyes moving around my home with an unsettling mix of curiosity and hunger. Under normal circumstances, my instincts would have recoiled at the sight of such an unprofessional character overseeing sensitive financial documents. In all my years managing engineering contracts, I had worked alongside top-tier legal professionals, people of impeccable bearing and precision. But my thinking was clouded by the raw image that wouldn't leave me, my daughter sobbing on my floor just hours before. I was playing the part of the exhausted, grieving father, worn down by the emotional weight of the previous night, and wanting nothing more than to restore some peace to what remained of my family. I simply wanted Nadia to stop crying. I wanted to keep the promise I'd made to her mother. Leland steered Floyd to the large oak dining table and gestured for him to open the briefcase. Floyd unlatched the brass clasps and drew out a formidable stack of legal documents, setting them squarely in front of my chair. Leland positioned himself behind Floyd, hovering over the table with a coiled, restless energy. He wore a practiced smile, but there was a faint sheen of sweat on his forehead that his composure couldn't quite conceal. "Garrison," Leland said, his tone careful and deeply respectful, "I cannot begin to thank you for this. We had our legal team working through the night to make sure we'd hit the bank's deadline, as we discussed. This is strictly the formation of the Family Limited Liability Company and the authorization to transfer management rights of this estate into the corporate portfolio. He pointed to the top page, his manicured finger tracing a line of dense, tangled legal text. He launched into an elaborate breakdown of American estate tax codes working in terms like generational wealth transfer, asset protection shields, and fiduciary management buffers. It all sounded thoroughly sophisticated. The logic of avoiding crippling inheritance taxes at the time of my eventual passing made complete sense on the surface. It is a standard strategy used by wealthy families throughout the country to keep their assets out of the federal government's reach. I had no reason to believe that a man who had sat at my Thanksgiving table for 10 years was using legitimate tax planning as a smokescreen for outright theft. I settled into my chair, picked up the heavy brass pen Floyd had nervously laid down, and adjusted my reading glasses. I began working through the pages. There were at least 50 pages of dense, single-spaced text. I read the opening sections with care. They outlined the creation of Crane Family Holdings and defined my role as a passive beneficiary, while Leland stepped in as managing director. It matched everything we had talked about: a temporary measure to steady his company against a malicious lawsuit, a bureaucratic maneuver to show bank examiners that his portfolio carried real weight behind it. The legitimate language in the early pages of that stack put me at ease in a way I would come to regret deeply. I let my guard down, allowing fatigue and fatherly devotion to override the analytical instincts I had built over an entire career. Leland moved closer, his voice quiet and even. Just initial the bottom of each page, garrison, and sign wherever the yellow tabs are marked. It's mostly standard boilerplate the state of Georgia requires for LLC formation. Floyd leaned in, opening his ink pad and positioning his notary stamp. I began to sign. Page after page of bureaucratic filler, the scratch of the pen filling the quiet kitchen. My thoughts drifted to Nadia's desperate pleas. I thought about the promise I'd made to her mother. I believed in my bones that I was doing something noble, a selfless act, to pull my child back from the edge of financial ruin. I was entirely peacefully unaware of the lethal document that had been slipped with surgical care into the precise middle of the stack. Buried among pages of meaningless corporate bylaws and tax indemnification language sat a single devastating sheet. A quit-claim deed. Signing that particular page meant I was not transferring management rights. I was legally surrendering all ownership, all equity, and every claim I held to my 5-acre property, handing it directly to Leland's holding company. I was giving away the home I had built with my own hands, transferring a multi-million-dollar piece of land to a predator without collecting a single cent. But I never read that page. My eyes were heavy, my heart was full of grief, and I trusted my family. I signed my name exactly where the bright yellow tab told me to, and the trap closed around my ankle. The instant my pen left the final signature line, the entire atmosphere in the room shifted. The tight, suffocating tension that had surrounded Leland since he walked in evaporated, replaced by an almost alarming euphoria. He exhaled hard and practically pulled the papers off the table before the ink had finished drying. Floyd began stamping these documents in rapid succession, his hands moving with a sudden efficiency that made it clear he'd been waiting for this moment. Leland reached over and grabbed my shoulder, squeezing it with a force that felt less like gratitude and more like conquest. "Garrison, you have saved us," he announced, his voice carrying a fraction too much volume for the quiet kitchen. "You have no idea what you have just done for our future. I'm taking these straight to the bank right now. We are going to be completely fine." He didn't linger to discuss his supposed legal battle. He gathered the documents with startling speed and walked out the front door, leaving me standing alone by the kitchen table. That afternoon, Nadia called. The devastated, trembling woman from the night before was completely gone. Her voice was light and unbothered. She thanked me, mentioned the bank had pre-approved the loan and that everything was back on track. She sounded so entirely fine that a small, cold seed of unease lodged itself somewhere in the back of my mind. Just a flicker, my analytical instincts quietly noting that human beings don't bounce back from the edge of total ruin that fast. But I chose not to follow the thought. I poured another cup of coffee, looked out at the sprawling green lawn, and told myself that my home was safe and my family was whole. I had no idea the clock on my own destruction had just started running. I had no idea my sanctuary had already been taken from me legally, cleanly, without a trace of hesitation. The full weight of their betrayal didn't arrive in a single dramatic moment. It walked onto my property exactly 2 weeks before Deputy Hobbs ever appeared on my porch, delivered in the form of a routine bureaucratic intrusion on an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday afternoon. The Georgia sun was warm on the back of my neck as I knelt in the soft dirt of my front garden. I was carefully trimming the heritage gardenia bushes that my late wife had planted the very first spring we moved into this house. Gardening had become my quiet discipline since she passed away, to keep my hands occupied and my mind tethered to something real. I was brushing soil from my heavy canvas work gloves when a flash of neon yellow snagged the corner of my eye. I rose slowly, my joints registering the familiar protest of age, and squinted against the bright afternoon light. Roughly 50 yards away, near the heavy iron gates marking the western boundary of my 5-acre estate, stood a man I had never seen before. He had on a bright, high-visibility construction vest over a plaid shirt, a white hard hat, and heavy work boots. Planted in the grass beside him was a yellow tripod supporting a sophisticated digital theodolite. He was bent over the optical lens, making careful sweeping adjustments to the leveling knobs and occasionally marking notes on a digital tablet strapped to his forearm. My first assumption was that he was a county surveyor. The city sent utility crews out from time to time to check public water lines or verify municipal boundaries along the main road. I figured he'd drifted a few yards past the public easement and onto my private ground. I dried the sweat from my forehead, collected my heavy hickory cane from the porch, and crossed the wide lawn to give him a polite redirection. The crunch of my boots on the dry grass announced my approach. He straightened up from the theodolite, raised a hand against the sun, and gave me a courteous nod. "Good afternoon, sir," he said pleasantly. "Beautiful piece of land you've got out here." I nodded back and stopped about 10 feet from his equipment. "Thank you," I said, keeping everything cordial. "I take considerable pride in it, but I do need to understand what brings you past that gate." The county lines end about 30 feet back toward the road. Everything on this side is strictly private residential property. The surveyor gave me a mildly apologetic look and tapped the screen of his rugged tablet, scrolling through something I couldn't quite make out. "I'm sorry if I've caused any confusion, sir," he said, his brow creasing as he read, "but I'm not actually with the county. I'm an independent commercial contractor. Piedmont Commercial Bank hired me to carry out a full topographic survey and a commercial appraisal of this specific parcel." Something heavy and cold settled in my chest, but I kept my posture completely still. An engineer doesn't respond to an anomaly by raising his voice. He gathers more information. "A commercial appraisal?" I said, holding my tone steady despite the chill radiating outward from somewhere along my spine. "That makes no sense whatsoever. This is a private single-family home, has been for 30 years. There is no commercial operation of any kind running on this land, and there never will be." The surveyor's expression moved from mild puzzlement to visible discomfort. He seemed to be deciding whether he was dealing with an eccentric neighbor or an elderly man who simply didn't know what was happening on his own property. "Sir, I'm just an independent contractor working off a job order," he said carefully, his voice going gentle. "But according to the bank's files, this entire 5-acre parcel is currently under active evaluation for a large-scale commercial redevelopment project." My hand tightened around the hickory cane, the smooth wood pressing hard against my palm. "A redevelopment project," I said, my voice dropping a full register, all warmth gone from it. "Ordered by whom exactly?" He swiped the glass screen and pulled up the executive summary of his work order. He read the name out loud, and each syllable landed like a separate blow. The primary applicant is listed as Crane Holdings LLC, he said plainly. The bank requires this topographical data to finalize a multi-million-dollar commercial construction loan. Per the approved blueprints attached to this file, Crane Holdings has scheduled a complete demolition of all existing residential structures on this plot. They intend to break ground on a luxury commercial strip mall next month. The afternoon breeze turned to ice against my skin. The world around me shed all its ambient sound, the mockingbirds, the distant highway, the rustle of the oak leaves. All of it faded into a flat, ringing silence. My mind, conditioned over decades to process catastrophic structural failures, began assembling this new data without being asked. Crane Holdings LLC, Leland's company? The same company that had supposedly been using my property's management rights as nothing more than a passive buffer against future estate taxes. The same company Nadia swore was only holding the paperwork to back a modest survival loan and keep them out of bankruptcy. They hadn't wanted management rights to protect my legacy. They had maneuvered me step by patient step into handing over my home so they could level it and pocket a commercial fortune from the rubble. The surveyor shifted his weight, clearly rattled by the length of my silence. "Are you all right, sir?" he asked, stepping forward slightly. "Do you need me to call someone? Are you a tenant here?" His questions pulled me back. I looked at the theodolite, its lens aimed straight at the front door of the house where I had raised my daughter, the house where my wife had taken her last breath. I drew a slow breath and pushed the fury and heartbreak down all the way down and sealed them behind a wall of iron composure. "I'm perfectly fine," I said, my voice even and deliberate. "I am not a tenant. I am the man who built that house. I appreciate you explaining your presence here today. You're doing your job, and I won't get in your way. Please finish your measurements and have a safe afternoon." I turned and started the long walk back across the lawn toward my front porch. Every step felt different from the ones I'd taken 10 minutes before. The ground under my boots no longer felt like sanctuary. It felt like contested territory. I climbed the porch steps, the planks solid under my feet, heavier somehow than I remembered. I didn't go to my usual chair. I didn't stop in the kitchen. I walked straight into the study. The air inside felt altered, contaminated by whatever was being planned just beyond the windows. I picked up my phone from the mahogany desk and held my thumb over Nadia's contact. Part of me, the part that was still just a father, wanted badly to believe this was some enormous clerical mistake. But the other part, the part that had spent a career calculating pressure thresholds and stress fractures in steel, already knew. I pressed call and held the phone to my ear. It rang 4 times before she answered. The moment the line opened, I was hit by the background noise. It was not the sound of a struggling company fighting off bankruptcy. What I heard was the bright clinking of crystal glasses, the easy laughter of wealthy people at leisure, and the smooth undercurrent of a jazz band piped through a high-end sound system. "Nadia," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. "We need to talk. There's a man with a digital theodolite standing on the western edge of my property. He tells me he's conducting a commercial topographic survey on behalf of Crane Holdings." A short pause. I heard her muffle the phone a second, no more, almost certainly whispering something to Leland. When she came back, her voice had taken on that particular brand of sweet condescension that people use on small children, or the senile. "Dad," she sighed, a soft, breathy sound, weighted with manufactured patience. "You're getting confused again. I told you about this, remember? That's just a routine tax appraisal part of the process for the family management company we established to protect your estate. You don't need to worry about it. Let the man finish his work and go back to your gardening. Everything is completely fine." Somewhere in the background, a voice came over a public address system. The words were partially muffled, but I caught the phrase clearly enough: fresh powder on the summit. They were at a ski resort. They were in Vail. "Nadia," I said, not giving an inch to her tone. "County tax appraisers don't carry commercial redevelopment blueprints. This man specifically stated that Crane Holdings is planning a demolition, a luxury strip mall on this land. Her voice sharpened slightly, a fraction of the sweetness peeling away. Dad, you're genuinely overthinking this. The bank uses standard commercial forms for large acreage properties. It's purely procedural. Leland is managing all the complex financial details, so you don't have to. We're in the middle of a very important meeting with potential investors right now, and I really do need to go. Make yourself some tea, okay? I love you. The line went dead. The hollow pulse of the dial tone filled the quiet study. I set the phone down on the desk without a sound. I didn't throw it. I didn't curse. I didn't put my fist through the wall. Instead, a cold and absolute clarity moved through me from the inside out. 35 years as a petroleum chief engineer. My entire professional life was built around one discipline: finding anomalies before they found you. When you're running a deep-water drilling rig, a microscopic hairline fracture in a pressure valve can trigger a catastrophic explosion, billions of dollars gone, hundreds of lives with them. The training is absolute. Never dismiss the data, no matter how badly you want the readings to be wrong. You look at the math, you examine the structural integrity, and you let the evidence overrule the story. Standing alone in my study, I applied that same rigorous methodology to my own daughter and son-in-law. I started running the numbers. Data point number 1. 4 months ago, Leland sat across from me at my kitchen table and swore that a malicious lawsuit was strangling his technology company. His assets were frozen, he said. Bankruptcy was closing in fast. Data point number 2. Just 2 weeks ago, Leland rolled into my driveway to drop off my groceries behind the wheel of a brand new custom-ordered Porsche. When I mentioned it offhandedly, he brushed it off as a short-term corporate lease, a necessary image expense for the clients. Data point number 3. Nadia had picked up my call from a luxury ski resort in Vail, Colorado, telling me she was in an investor meeting, while the sound of clinking glasses and laughter carried clearly through the phone on a Tuesday afternoon. The structural integrity of their story was buckling under its own weight. Bankrupt people don't acquire six-figure luxury vehicles. People staring down total financial ruin don't slip away on lavish midweek getaways to exclusive mountain resorts. The math was wrong. The pressure readings were completely off. They weren't drowning. They were sitting on cash. My mind snapped back to the night they came to me, desperate, begging for help. I had offered my liquid savings. I had offered to write a personal check to keep them from losing their home. Leland had flatly refused. Cash wasn't what he wanted. He specifically needed the deed to my property. He needed the physical land. He needed the asset itself. The surveyor hadn't made a mistake. The blueprints in his hands were entirely real. Leland and Nadia had deliberately weaponized my grief. They had taken my profound love for my late wife and the promise I made to protect our daughter and used it as a psychological crowbar to wrench the deed to my home from my hands. They had constructed a perfectly legal facade to steal a multi-million-dollar estate, fully intending to bulldoze the only physical connection I still had to my past. I crossed the room to the large bay window and looked out over the front lawn. The surveyor was breaking down his bright yellow tripod, wrapping up his work for the day. He was locking in the final data points needed to seal my fate. The grief that had gripped my chest for 4 months began to change, hardening, crystallizing into a dense, impenetrable layer of cold resolve. I was no longer a grieving widower trying to hold his family together. I was an engineer diagnosing a critical system failure. Leland and Nadia believed they had successfully circumvented every defense I had. They assumed my age had left me blind, deaf, and pliable. But an engineer never works from assumptions. An engineer demands physical proof. I knew precisely what had to come next. I needed to see the blueprint of their betrayal with my own eyes. I needed the raw data. I needed to get inside their empty house today. The truth was sitting in the dark, waiting for me, and I was ready to drag it out into the light. I walked to my heavy pickup truck, my mind fixed on a single, undeniable objective: The drive from my rural property to Leland and Nadia's upscale rented townhouse took nearly 40 minutes. With every mile closer to that affluent suburb, the anger in my chest grew harder, more solid. I had brought a handful of misdelivered mail that had shown up at my address a few days earlier, a perfectly plausible reason for an unannounced fatherly visit. If they happened to be home, I'd hand over the envelopes, smile, and walk away. But my instincts, sharpened over decades of anticipating the unpredictable, told me the house would be empty. Nadia had claimed to be in an investor meeting, while every sound behind her placed her squarely at a luxury ski resort. Leland was almost certainly right beside her, toasting their incoming windfall. I turned onto their immaculate tree-lined street and parked 2 houses down. The neighborhood was unnervingly quiet, manicured hedges, expensive cars, nobody watching. I grabbed the mail from the passenger seat, walked up their pristine concrete driveway, and pressed the glowing doorbell camera. I waited, counting seconds, silently. I rang it a second time. The house stayed completely still. No footsteps. No movement behind the frosted glass. They were gone. I turned from the door, my heart beating with a slow, steady rhythm. I was about to cross a significant line, but they had already crossed the ultimate one by stealing my entire future. I stepped off the porch and walked at an easy, unhurried pace down the side path toward the backyard alley. I moved like a man with every right to be exactly where he was. Behind a tall wooden privacy fence sat 3 large municipal garbage bins. Collection was tomorrow, and they were overflowing. In the engineering world, when you suspect catastrophic wrongdoing, you don't ask the guilty party to confess voluntarily. You search for the discarded data. You audit the waste. I lifted the heavy plastic lid off the black recycling bin. Beneath a layer of empty imported wine bottles and upscale takeout containers, I found exactly what I was looking for. 2 tightly knotted grocery bags stuffed with paper waste. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed them by their handles and carried them straight back to my truck. I dropped them onto the passenger floorboard, got behind the wheel, and drove away without a single glance in the mirror. My hands gripped the leather steering wheel as I worked through the winding suburban roads. A strange clarity settled over me. The confusion and the lingering grief that had clouded my thinking for 4 months had lifted entirely. I was running on pure logic now, and a deep, burning hunger for absolute justice. I needed to see the physical blueprint of their betrayal with my own eyes. By the time I got back to my property, the late afternoon sun was sliding below the tree line. I carried the bags inside and locked the front door behind me. In the living room, I shoved the heavy coffee table aside and spread a wide vinyl tarp flat across the hardwood floor. I emptied the first bag, mostly junk mail, glossy magazines, hollow envelopes. But the second bag was something else entirely. It held a dense mound of cross-cut paper shreds. Leland had clearly invested in a heavy-duty shredder, but he had badly underestimated the patience of an engineer. He believed destroying the physical documents would permanently erase the trail of his deception. What he didn't understand was that reconstructing shattered fragments was the work I had spent my entire career doing. I sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by thousands of tiny paper ribbons. I gathered a roll of clear adhesive tape, a pair of sharp tweezers, and a bright desk lamp. The agonizingly slow process of sorting began. Shreds with blue ink separated from those with black, tiny fragments bearing red corporate letterhead pulled to one side. Hour after hour passed in total silence. The sun vanished completely, leaving the house washed in the harsh, artificial glow of my lamp. My back ached and my eyes burned without mercy, but stopping was never a consideration. By midnight, a clear and deeply troubling picture had begun to take shape on the tarp. The first document I managed to reconstruct was an internal email chain between Leland and a major commercial real estate developer. The subject line read, "Project Sanctuary Acquisition." Those words turned my bloodstone cold. They had mockingly named the demolition project after the very word I used to describe my home. The emails laid out the specific timeline for transferring the deed from the fraudulent family management company into a newly formed corporate holding account, one controlled entirely by Leland. But the most damning evidence came together near the center of the tarp. It was a massive multi-page financial prospectus, heavily detailed and legally binding. I carefully taped the final corner of the summary page into place and read the bold, black text. The document outlined a commercial development plan budgeted at exactly $3.5 million. It listed my exact residential address, my precise property lines, my geographic coordinates. The proposal called for the complete demolition of all existing residential structures, clearing of the ancient oak trees, and the laying of a massive concrete parking lot. The primary anchor tenant listed on the second page was a high-end corporate retail chain. My home, my sanctuary, it wasn't being managed to shield my estate from taxes. It was slated for total irreversible demolition in less than 30 days. I sat back on my heels and stared at the taped-together documents until the black letters swam out of focus. The sheer, calculated cruelty of what they had engineered was absolutely staggering. This had nothing to do with desperation or financial panic. It was not some last-minute scramble to rescue a failing technology startup. This was a premeditated, meticulously orchestrated corporate heist. The email chain I'd pieced together stretched back over 8 months. They had been engineering this long before that rainy Tuesday night, when they appeared on my porch in tears. Nadia's desperate sobbing, Leland's frantic pacing, the deliberate invocation of my dead wife's memory. Every bit of it was a rehearsed theatrical performance, engineered to exploit my deepest emotional vulnerabilities. They knew I would never willingly part with that land. They knew I wanted to preserve the house where so much of my life had unfolded. So they abandoned any attempt at my logic and went straight for my heart. They manufactured a fake crisis, brought in a fake notary, and slid a real quitclaim deed into a stack of fraudulent management papers. They robbed me of my property right in front of my eyes, smiling the entire time as they sprung their flawless trap. Now at last, I understood the full and horrifying truth of their utterly ruthless financial betrayal. I sat alone on the study floor, surrounded by the wreckage of a reality I no longer recognized. The initial swell of nauseating shock had crested and broken, leaving behind a cold, sterile emptiness. I stared at the reconstructed blueprint, tracing the dark lines that mapped the destruction of everything I had built. The depth of their greed was almost impossible to absorb. Alone wasn't enough. They wanted every blade of grass, every brick, and every memory ground to dust for a commercial payout. But as the emotional fog began to lift, an analytical question pushed its way to the surface. The pieces fit. They showed me the objective, but they didn't explain the precise mechanical execution of the crime. How had they legally bound me to my own destruction? I closed my eyes and carried myself back to that morning in my kitchen. I replayed the entire encounter, examining every variable, every spoken word, every gesture. I could see the tall stack of legal documents sitting on the dining table. I remembered Leland standing just over my shoulder, voice steady and calm as he pointed to the bright yellow, sticky tabs. I remembered Floyd, the sweaty notary, gripping his stamp like a weapon. The architecture of their deception slowly came into focus. The pages at the top of that stack were entirely legitimate standard boilerplate, laying out the formation of Crane Family Holdings, language consistent with the temporary management transfer story we had discussed. I had read those opening pages, carefully confirming they matched the narrative of a short-term transfer to sidestep estate taxes. But by the time I worked into the middle of the stack, my eyes were heavy and my chest was weighted down by my daughter's manufactured grief. I had stopped reading the fine print. I had simply trusted them. I moved my pen from one yellow tab to the next, initialing and signing wherever Leland directed. That was the precise moment the bait and switch was executed. Buried deep inside the numbing layers of corporate bylaws and tax indemnification clauses sat the lethal quit-claim deed. It was a document engineered to completely sever my ownership and transfer the full legal title of my 5-acre estate directly into Leland's corporate holding account in a single stroke. By signing that one page, I had handed over a multi-million-dollar property without receiving a single penny. Floyd was there to provide the official state sanction, pressing his notary seal to ensure the fraudulent transfer was ironclad and legally airtight. They had weaponized my love, my exhaustion, and my trust to slip right past every logical defense I had. My hands curled into tight fists, fingernails cutting into my palms. A dark primal surge flared in my chest. Every first instinct I had screamed at me to grab my truck keys and drive straight to their upscale townhouse. I wanted to kick their front door off its frame. I wanted to throw the taped blueprint across their expensive glass coffee table and demand to know how my own daughter could do this to me. I wanted to scream until my lungs gave out to confront them with the undeniable physical evidence of their sickening betrayal. I wanted to watch the smug certainty drain from their faces the moment they realized their foolproof plan had been completely exposed. But my engineering training slammed the brakes on that impulse instantly. When you identify a critical failure inside a highly volatile system, you do not start swinging a hammer at the pipes. An uncontrolled reaction can cause the entire structure to blow apart. If I walked in on Leland and Nadia right now, I would surrender the only tactical advantage I had. I would be showing my hand. Leland was a cunning, slippery corporate operator. The moment he understood I had uncovered the fraudulent quitclaim deed, apologies would be the last thing on his mind. He would go straight on the offensive. He would destroy whatever digital evidence remained, move the commercial loan funds into offshore accounts, and immediately surround himself with a team of ruthless defense attorneys. They would build a narrative casting me as a confused, senile old man who had signed away his own property of his own free will. They would bury me in litigation until my resources were exhausted and I was driven out regardless. I drew a slow, deliberate breath, consciously pulling my heart rate back down. The loving, trusting father, who had wanted nothing more than to protect his little girl, died right there on the study floor. That man was gone, buried under the shredded proof of his daughter's profound greed. What rose from the wide vinyl tarp was something else entirely. I was no longer a grieving widower. I was a cold, deliberate hunter, and my prey was squarely in my sights. I gathered the taped documents with care, folding the damning commercial blueprint with meticulous precision. I crossed to the heavy steel safe concealed behind a wall panel in my study, worked the combination dial, and locked the evidence inside. I collected the remaining paper shreds, sealed them into a heavy-duty garbage bag, and tied it off. Every trace of the investigation was wiped clean. The illusion of compliance had to hold. I had to keep playing the role of the unsuspecting cooperative father who believed his family was finally secure. I went to the kitchen and poured the cold remnants of my morning coffee down the stainless steel sink. I stood studying my reflection in the dark glass of the window. The face looking back was worn, but the eyes behind it were sharp and utterly focused. If Leland wanted to play a high-stakes game of corporate theft, I needed to upgrade my arsenal. I couldn't fight a complex legal battle armed with nothing but an engineering background and a trash-sourced paper reconstruction. I needed someone who knew intimately how commercial real estate fraud was constructed and how to take it apart. A professional who could systematically dismantle Leland's holding company, freeze his assets, and expose his forgery to federal authorities before he had a single second to respond. Not a standard family lawyer. I needed a legal shark, a ruthless, relentless litigator who made a career out of destroying corrupt executives. My mind went back to a massive corporate dispute I had witnessed a decade earlier. A rival oil conglomerate had attempted a hostile takeover of a drilling project using falsified environmental reports. Our company had brought in an outside legal consultant to manage the litigation. He was a brilliant, terrifyingly precise man who dismantled opposing counsel in a matter of weeks and left their executives staring down criminal charges. His name was Prescott Dunbar, and he was universally feared across the corporate sector for his uncompromising, aggressive approach. Prescott did not negotiate settlements. He annihilated his opponents and left nothing standing behind him. I went back to my study and opened my leather contact book. I turned through the pages until I found his direct private number. I picked up my smartphone, hand completely steady, and dialed. I listened to the ringing, watching moonlight stretch long shadows across my lawn. The hunter was about to become the hunted. 3 rings and a gruff voice answered. It wasn't Prescott. It was his senior partner who told me Prescott had retired. He did, however, give me the direct contact information for the one man Prescott trusted with complex asset recovery. The man's name was Sterling Caffrey, a veteran trust and real estate litigator operating out of downtown Atlanta. I laid out the basics of my situation to his answering service and left my secure contact details. With the legal foundation quietly set in motion, I knew I had to buy myself time to build an airtight case. Leland and Nadia were moving fast, driven by the promise of an enormous commercial payout. If they caught even flickers of suspicion that I was investigating their fraudulent quitclaim deed, they would push the demolition schedule forward without hesitation. I needed them completely relaxed, utterly certain of their victory, and entirely dismissive of me as any kind of threat. To get there, I decided to inhabit the exact character they had already written for me in their twisted version of events. I would become the confused, deteriorating old man they believed they had so effortlessly swindled. The very next morning, I began the meticulous performance of my own cognitive decline. I started small, with subtle, calibrated errors. When Nadia came by under the pretense of bringing me lunch, I deliberately called her by her late mother's name. I caught the flash of triumph in her eyes, quickly buried beneath an expression of practiced condescending sympathy. I fumbled through our conversation, circling back to the same dull questions about her husband's fabricated legal troubles. Over the following days, I escalated the performance with careful, deliberate precision. I left my heavy brass keyring sitting on the middle shelf of the kitchen refrigerator beside a carton of milk, making sure Leland would be the one to discover it when he reached in for a beer. I watched from the hallway as he fished the cold keys out of the fridge, shaking his head and muttering a cruel little joke under his breath. I began missing our scheduled phone calls on purpose, claiming afterward that I couldn't figure out how to work my smartphone. I even started raising concerns about a sudden and troubling deterioration in my heart condition. I would settle into my armchair, clutching my chest, breathing in short, shallow pulls, murmuring about phantom pains radiating down my left arm. Nadia played her role flawlessly, hovering over me with manufactured concern while exchanging knowing, victorious glances with Leland across the room. They bought every bit of it. In their minds, my rapid decline was the ideal outcome. A senile, physically failing father would never have the mental sharpness to contest a complex corporate real estate transfer. They believed I was simply fading a convenient ghost, haunting the property they were about to bulldoze. Their guard, previously held in place through cautious, rehearsed phone calls and scripted visits, dropped away entirely. They stopped asking pointed questions about my daily routine. They stopped tracking my movements. They simply left me alone to deteriorate, certain the battle was already behind them. That manufactured isolation gave me exactly the operational window I needed. On a crisp Thursday morning, while Leland and Nadia were supposedly off attending another crucial session with their phantom investors, I initiated my counteroffensive. I dressed in a plain, unremarkable gray suit. Nothing that would draw a second glance from anyone, just an elderly man on his way to a routine appointment. I left my primary smartphone sitting on the kitchen counter, well aware that Leland had likely loaded a location tracking application onto it under the cover of monitoring my health. I slipped a prepaid, untraceable cell phone I had purchased with cash into my jacket pocket. I climbed into my heavy pickup truck, pulled out of the gravel driveway, my pulse steady and deliberate. I did not head straight for the towering glass skyline of downtown Atlanta. Instead, I worked through a winding series of rural backroads, keeping a close eye on my rearview mirror the entire way. I eventually merged onto the highway and folded into the flow of traffic. Nearing the city center, I deliberately skirted the expensive parking garages clustered around the legal district. I left the truck 3 blocks away in a dim municipal structure. I paid the fee in cash, turned my collar up, and set off on foot toward the financial heart of the city. The streets of Atlanta were alive with young professionals, none of them giving a second thought to the quiet old man moving among them. I walked with purposeful strides, my mind fixed entirely on the battle ahead. I arrived at last, at a sleek, imposing building, all dark glass and polished steel rising against the sky. I bypassed the main reception desk and rode a private elevator directly to the 38th floor. The brass plaque beside the heavy mahogany doors read simply, Sterling Caffrey Corporate Litigation and Trust Recovery. I pushed through into a waiting room that radiated quiet, ruthless authority. The walls displayed stark modern art, and the receptionist sat behind a vast slab of black marble. I gave my name, and within moments I was escorted down a long, hushed corridor into a corner office with sweeping views across the Georgia Capitol. Behind a wide, immaculate desk stood Sterling Caffrey. He was a tall, commanding man in his late 50s, sharp, predatory eyes, and a jawline that looked like it had been cut from stone. He wore a custom-tailored navy suit that fit him like a second skin, like armor. He extended a firm hand and gestured toward a chair opposite the desk. "Mr. Pruitt," he said, his voice a low, controlled baritone that left no room for uncertainty. "Prescott's former partner gave me a brief overview of your situation. He mentioned a fraudulent quitclaim deed and a multi-million-dollar commercial demolition project orchestrated by your own family." I settled into the chair, feeling the crushing weight of the past 2 weeks begin to shift from my shoulders onto his desk. "That is correct, Mr. Caffrey," I answered, my voice level and completely free of the senile tremor I had perfected for my daughter. "They ran a highly sophisticated bait and switch using a fraudulent family management company to take my 5-acre estate. They intend to level my home in under 30 days to put up a luxury retail center." Sterling Caffrey leaned forward, elbows on the polished wood, dark eyes working through me with cold, analytical precision. "Most men your age would be entirely broken by a betrayal like this," he observed quietly. "You don't look broken. You look like a man who's preparing to go to war." I reached into my pocket and drew out a thick envelope containing the coordinates, corporate registration numbers, and the reconstructed blueprints I had pulled from Leland's garbage. I set it squarely in the center of his desk. "I am not broken," I said clearly, holding his gaze without blinking. "I am an engineer, and I have identified a catastrophic structural failure. I am here to retain you to dismantle their operation, freeze their assets, and salt the earth beneath them. I want them completely and utterly destroyed." Sterling Caffrey did not flinch. A slow, razor-thin smile moved across his face, the kind a predator wears just before it strikes. He reached across the desk and picked up the envelope. He did not ask whether I was certain. He did not suggest the virtues of family reconciliation or propose a quiet, out-of-court mediation. He simply pressed a button on his desk phone and called in his paralegal team. For the next 3 hours, I sat in that chair, while Sterling transformed his corner office into a war room. He mobilized forensic accountants, engaged title search agencies, and cut through bureaucratic red tape with a terrifying, practiced efficiency. He treated my garbage-salvaged blueprints not as trash, but as a map leading directly to a crime scene. I watched him work, sipping a glass of iced water, feeling the last remnants of my paternal grief burn away, replaced by the cold, structural logic of approaching justice. By late afternoon, the sun was throwing long, golden shadows across the Atlanta skyline. Sterling walked back into the room, holding a stiff manila folder. He dropped into his chair, his expression settling into something notably grim. He opened the folder and slid a certified county-stamped document across the polished surface toward me. I knew what it was before I read a single word of the bold print at the top of the page. The quitclaim deed. Sterling tapped the bottom right corner with a silver pen, pressing the tip lightly against the desk for emphasis. "They filed this with the county clerk exactly 1 day after they sat at your kitchen table," he said, his voice stripped of any emotion. "You were entirely correct about their methodology, Mr. Pruitt. They buried this complete transfer of ownership right in the middle of standard limited liability formation papers. You signed away your entire estate under the fabricated pretense of establishing a tax management vehicle. I stared at my own signature. The ink was dark and unwavering. Beside it sat the official stamp of Floyd, the sweaty, nervous notary who had been the instrument of the theft. Seeing the physical document, the actual legal mechanism of my ruin, made the betrayal land with a visceral weight that shredded trash never could. It was one thing to reconstruct their methodology from torn paper fragments, but holding the state-certified proof of their deception was an entirely different experience. I ran my index finger slowly along the line of my signature. I told him I had initialed 50 pages that morning, convinced I was securing my daughter's future. Sterling nodded slowly and pulled another document from the folder. The notary was fully complicit, he stated without hesitation. He deliberately skipped the standard verbal confirmation protocol. State law required him to ask you explicitly out loud whether you understood you were executing a quitclaim deed, surrendering your property rights. He intentionally omitted that mandated step to keep you completely in the dark about what was happening. It is a textbook case of fraudulent execution, but the seizure of the physical property was only the first stage of their operation. What I was about to uncover wasn't just a betrayal, it was the full, calculated depth of what the people closest to me had been quietly engineering against me for months. Before that discovery lands, tell me this: if someone you completely trusted turned out to be working against you the whole time, would you let them know you found out? Or would you keep that knowledge close and use it wisely? Sterling leaned back in his chair, fingertips pressed together. He regarded me with a blend of professional respect and genuine caution. The commercial redevelopment blueprints you pulled from their trash are entirely real, but they represent a long-term projection. Leland is not a patient man. He had no intention of waiting for construction permits to clear before monetizing what he'd stolen. He had executed a secondary maneuver the moment the deed was secured. Sterling slid a final stack of papers across the desk. These weren't county records. They were heavily redacted federal banking files. I scanned the top sheet, working through the dense financial data. Leland took your stolen certified quitclaim deed straight to Piedmont Commercial Bank, Sterling explained, his tone dropping to a dangerous near whisper. He used the full unencumbered equity of your 5-acre estate as prime collateral to secure an immediate massive cash loan. My eyes went to the bolded figures near the bottom of the banking contract. The number was staggering. Leland had walked away with a $2.5 million commercial cash loan drawn against my property. The funds had been wired directly into an offshore corporate holding account, controlled exclusively by Crane Holdings. That explained the custom-ordered Porsche. That explained the luxury ski trip to Vail on a random Tuesday afternoon. They were not fending off any lawsuit. They were living like royalty on stolen money. Leland didn't just take your land. Sterling continued, his eyes fixed hard on mine. By presenting a fraudulently obtained deed to a federally insured banking institution to secure commercial financing, your son-in-law crossed a very significant legal threshold. He committed textbook undeniable federal wire fraud and aggravated bank fraud. This is no longer a civil dispute over a family property transfer. This is a serious federal crime carrying decades of mandatory prison time. The silence that settled over the office was absolute. I sat with the weight of the data. My daughter and her husband had mortgaged my past to fund their present greed, and in doing so they had handed me precisely the weapon I needed to ruin them. A civil suit to reverse the deed would let Leland drag things out for years, burning through the very money he had stolen from me. But federal bank fraud was a different matter entirely. The federal government does not broker arrangements with people who defraud insured banking institutions. Assets get frozen immediately. Tactical agents are deployed. The full merciless machinery of the law comes crashing down. I looked at Sterling, feeling a cold, settled calm descend over me. My senile old man routine had worked to perfection. They thought I was dissolving in my armchair, completely unaware that I had been quietly assembling a financial warhead directly beneath their feet. What is our precise tactical approach, Mr. Caffrey? I asked, my voice carrying clearly through the stillness of the room. I don't want to merely frighten them. I want the trap to close so fast they don't even see it coming. Sterling smiled again, the same thin, predatory smile, and gathered the documents, tapping them into a neat stack against the desk. "We construct an impenetrable fortress of evidence," he replied smoothly. "We trace every cent of that $2.5 million wire transfer. We document their luxury expenditures to demonstrate the funds were never used for legitimate corporate purposes. We compile a dossier so thoroughly damning that federal prosecutors will have no choice but to move immediately. And while we do all of that, you go home. You keep playing the confused, failing father. You let them walk your lawn with measuring tape. You let them sketch out their shopping center. You let them go on believing they are the sharpest minds in Georgia. We will let them keep digging quietly, patiently, right up until the exact moment we decide to bury them both beneath the full, crushing, inescapable weight of their own monstrous greed." Sterling Caffrey stared down at the banking documents fanned across his mahogany desk. Jaw clenched so hard, a muscle ticked in his cheek. A veteran attorney who had spent decades unraveling complex financial fraud, he was not a man easily rattled. Yet the sheer, brazen audacity of Leland's maneuver had ignited something sharp and professional inside him. He had just mapped the timeline of a flawlessly executed multi-million-dollar theft, and his legal mind could not abide the thought of the stolen capital disappearing into the void. He pushed his heavy leather chair back abruptly, wheels gliding silently across the thick carpet, and reached for the secure landline on the corner of his desk. "Mr. Pruitt," Sterling said, his voice dropping into a hard, authoritative register that brooked no discussion. "I appreciate the tactical case for patience, but we cannot allow $2.5 million of illicitly obtained federal funds to fully settle into a Caribbean tax haven. Once that money disperses through offshore shell accounts, recovery becomes an international jurisdictional nightmare. I have direct high-level contacts at the FBI's White-Collar Crimes Division. We need to make that call right now. Secure an emergency federal injunction and freeze Crane Holdings before your son-in-law moves another single cent." Sterling lifted the receiver finger poised above the keypad, fully prepared to bring the weight of the federal government to bear. But before he could press the first digit, I reached across the wide desk and placed my hand firmly over his. I didn't say anything immediately. I simply met his eyes, feeling a slow, cold smile spread across my face. It was the smile of an engineer watching an arrogant saboteur step directly onto a landmine he never knew was there. Sterling paused. His eyes narrowed, reading the absolute, unshakable certainty in my posture. He lowered the receiver slowly back into its cradle and leaned forward, his expression shifting into one of focused, guarded curiosity. "Chattariting," I said, my voice smooth and precisely measured, entirely free of the panic or desperation that typically follows the discovery of a loss this large. "I don't want you to contact the federal authorities yet. I don't want his offshore accounts frozen, and I have no interest in interrupting his celebration. In fact, I want Leland to feel completely untouchable. I want him to believe he has pulled off the most brilliant financial crime in the history of Georgia real estate." Sterling frowned, folding his hands on the desk. "With all due respect, Garrison allowing a criminal to actively launder millions of dollars against a forged quitclaim deed is an extraordinarily dangerous game. If we don't move quickly, he will drain the equity from your estate and leave you holding an empty, foreclosed bag." I shook my head slowly, the cold smile never leaving my face. "That is precisely where you are mistaken, my friend," I said quietly. "Leland cannot drain the equity from my estate because Leland does not own my estate. And more to the point, neither do I. I watched the seasoned litigator process that statement, sharp eyes scanning my face for confusion or instability. Finding none, I continued laying out the structural mechanics of my hidden defense. I want you to go back into your county property records, Sterling. Look past the fraudulent quitclaim deed that Leland filed 2 weeks ago. Go all the way back to October of 2017. Sterling turned immediately to his monitors, fingers moving across the keyboard with practiced speed. He pulled up the secure county clerk database and began working through the digital archives. As he scrolled through the historical filings tied to my residential address, I supplied the necessary context. In 2017, shortly after my late wife received her initial diagnosis, we sat down and had a very long, very difficult conversation about the future. I said, my voice steady, though the memory still carried its weight. We knew her condition was terminal. We also knew that our daughter Nadia had always had a weakness for fine things and expensive habits. We loved her completely, but we weren't blind to her nature. My wife was terrified that after she was gone, Nadia might eventually talk me into selling our sanctuary to finance some extravagant impulse. To honor my wife and protect the land we had built our life on together, I made a definitive, legally unassailable move. Sterling stopped typing. He leaned closer to his primary monitor, reading a deeply buried, highly complex legal filing. His eyes widened just slightly, a rare crack of genuine astonishment crossing his composed features. I engaged a specialized estate firm in Savannah. I continued laying out the architecture of my hidden fortress. A firm with no connections whatsoever to anyone in Atlanta. I had taken the entire 5-acre estate, the house, the gardens, every blade of grass, and transferred absolute ownership into a highly restrictive, irrevocable, blind trust. A neutral third-party corporate fiduciary was named as the sole trustee. I am simply the designated occupant and passive beneficiary. I have the legal right to live on that property until I draw my last breath, but I hold no legal authority to sell it, leverage it, mortgage it, or sign it away. Sterling slowly pulled his gaze from the computer monitor and looked directly at me. The dawning comprehension spreading across his face was a magnificent thing to witness. He understood exactly what I had done. He grasped the full catastrophic magnitude of the trap Leland had walked blindly into. Therefore, I said, bringing the hammer down on the final, inescapable truth, the signature I placed on that fraudulent quitclaim deed at my kitchen table is legally worthless. It is a completely void instrument. I cannot transfer an asset I do not legally own. The deed conveyance to Crane Holdings is a spectacular, thoroughly documented legal fiction. A low rumble rose from Sterling's chest and broke into a genuine dark laugh. He leaned back in his chair, shaking his head in disbelief. He took a void piece of paper, a document with absolutely no legal standing, and presented it to a federally insured banking institution as primary collateral. Sterling said, laying out the fatal error. He defrauded a major commercial bank out of $2.5 million using an asset that never existed. Garrison, your son-in-law didn't just steal from you. He stole from the federal government. He committed massive textbook wire fraud and aggravated bank fraud on an extraordinary scale. Exactly, I replied, my voice cold and stripped of any mercy. Which is precisely why we must not call the authorities today. We let Leland proceed with his fraudulent eviction. Once he presents that void deed to law enforcement, his criminal intent becomes absolutely undeniable. The FBI will have an airtight federal case. I left Sterling Caffrey in his corner office overlooking the Atlanta skyline, his legal machinery quietly spinning up to speed. We had a bulletproof strategy to land Leland in a federal wire fraud indictment. But a persistent shadow of doubt lingered in the analytical part of my mind when it came to my daughter. Leland was the corporate architect of the loan scheme, but Nadia had been the psychological key that dismantled my defenses. I needed to know beyond any remaining doubt the precise depth of her involvement. Was she simply a passive beneficiary of her husband's ruthless ambition, or was she a willing, active participant in her father's destruction? To build an airtight case against her, I needed raw, unfiltered audio. I needed to hear how she spoke when she believed no one was listening. I drove to a specialized electronics retailer on the outskirts of the city and purchased a military-grade voice-activated micro-recorder equipped with real-time cellular transmission and a continuous GPS tracker. It was smaller than a standard matchbook, encased in matte black plastic and nearly invisible in shadow. I returned to my quiet estate, the house they already believed they owned, and set the stage for my performance. I brewed a pot of peppermint tea, letting it steep until it had gone lukewarm and sharp. I wrinkled my clothes, skipped shaving, and adjusted my posture to reflect a man crumbling beneath the weight of his own deteriorating mind. Then I picked up my smartphone and called Nadia. I forced my breathing shallow and uneven. I let my voice tremble, threading in just the right note of pitiful, bewildered confusion. "Nadia," I wheezed, pausing to cough weakly. "I am having a terrible day. I cannot locate the property tax files anywhere and my chest feels very tight. Could you come over and have some tea with your old father?" She hesitated for the briefest fraction of a second, long enough to weigh the inconvenience against the need to maintain her devoted daughter facade. "Of course, Dad," she answered, her voice coated in manufactured warmth. "I will be right there. Just sit down and rest." She arrived less than an hour later. Through the front window, I watched her climb out of her car, carrying an oversized, impeccably crafted burgundy Gucci handbag. It was a brand new limited edition piece that cost more than I used to bring home in 2 full months of hard labor. A tangible leather-bound monument to the federal bank fraud they had just pulled off. I shuffled to the front door, hands trembling on purpose as I fumbled with the brass deadbolt. When I finally pulled it open, she greeted me with a tight, rehearsed smile. Her eyes moved quickly over my disheveled appearance, and I caught it, that fleeting, unmistakable flash of deep satisfaction. She had swallowed the performance whole. In her mind, my physical and mental deterioration was advancing perfectly in step with her demolition timeline. I led her into the kitchen, my steps deliberately slow and unsteady. I poured the tea with a shaking wrist, allowing a small puddle of amber liquid to spread across the granite countertop. "Oh, look what I have done," I muttered, dropping my head in manufactured embarrassment. "My hands just do not cooperate the way they used to." "I am so sorry, Nadia." She exhaled a soft sound of barely concealed irritation and set her burgundy Gucci bag carefully on the center of the kitchen island, well clear of the spill. "It is fine, Dad," she said, snatching a paper towel and wiping the counter with short, impatient strokes. "Just sit down before you hurt yourself." I lowered myself into one of the wooden kitchen chairs and rested my hands on my knees. We sat in silence for a stretch. I wandered incoherently through a story about the weather, deliberately losing the thread mid-sentence. Nadia glanced at her diamond-encrusted wristwatch 3 times in under 5 minutes. She was restless, burning to get back to her stolen life. "Dad, I really need to use the restroom," she announced, standing abruptly and smoothing the front of her designer blouse. "I will be right back, and then I have to go. Leland is waiting for me to confirm dinner reservations." She turned and walked briskly down the hallway toward the guest bathroom. I stayed perfectly still, listening as the heavy wooden door clicked shut. Then a moment later came the muffled but unmistakable sound of her voice. She had taken a call. I rose from my chair with the silent, fluid ease of a man 30 years younger. I moved down the hallway and pressed my ear against the painted wood of the bathroom door. She was talking to Leland. "I am leaving in 5 minutes," she hissed, her voice tight with visceral contempt. "I cannot stand being in this house any longer. It literally smells of stale medicine and old age. He is completely losing his mind, Leland. He spilled tea all over himself like a toddler. We don't even need to worry about him contesting the eviction. He will probably be in a nursing home before the bulldozers ever show up." Her words, cruel, callous, utterly without remorse, were the final nail in the coffin of whatever paternal mercy I had left. The absolute confirmation of her active malice extinguished every last trace of doubt. She was not a victim. She was a predator. I stepped away from the door and moved in silence back to the kitchen. I positioned myself over the open burgundy Gucci handbag sitting on the island. I slipped my hand into my pocket and closed my fingers around the matte black micro recorder. I reached carefully into the luxurious interior of the purse, found a small zippered cosmetic pocket nestled against the dark silk lining, and with surgical precision, dropped the tiny device into the very bottom of the concealed compartment, and zipped it shut. Completely undetectable. I was back in my wooden kitchen chair, staring blankly at my cold cup of tea by the time she came back down the hallway. Nadia collected her purse, offered one last hollow promise to call me tomorrow, and practically bolted out the front door. I watched her car vanish down the street, carrying my digital operative straight into the beating heart of their criminal enterprise. Hours later, the dark Georgia night had fully settled over my isolated rural property. I sat completely alone in the deep, undisturbed quiet of my study. The only light in the room was the steady green glow of the audio receiver sitting on my polished mahogany desk. I poured myself a single measure of expensive aged scotch. I took a slow, deliberate sip, feeling the familiar warmth move down my throat. I leaned back in my worn wingback chair, closed my eyes for a moment, and eased the volume dial upward. The crisp, perfectly clear audio of Leland and Nadia laughing, reveling in their monumental theft, filled the dark room immediately. Every vicious word they spoke was permanently captured, delivering exactly the undeniable ammunition I needed to ensure they would both spend the next 2 decades inside a federal prison. The memory of that darkened study and its pulsing green light dissolved, swept away by the brutal brightness of a Georgia morning. I stood on the front porch, planks the air draped in the thick, wet weight of a summer day. Directly before me, clutching a manila folder around a fraudulent eviction notice, stood Deputy Hobbs. He looked genuinely ill at ease, rocking his weight from boot to boot, a young officer sent to handle what he'd been told was a routine matter, removing a confused, senile old man who'd simply lost his grip on his finances. The street around us was dead quiet, broken only by the obnoxious rhythmic blast of a car horn. I looked past the deputy toward the curb. Parked illegally across my driveway, blocking it completely, was Leland. He sat at the wheel of his custom silver Porsche window, rolled all the way down elbow, draped over the expensive leather, that smug and arrogant grin spread wide across his face. He pressed his palm flat against the horn and held it there, letting the sharp sound roll over the manicured lawns. "Time is up, Boomer," he shouted, his voice carrying easily through the still air. "Bring him out, officer. I've got a demolition crew on standby and I'm not paying them by the hour to sit around." Leland laughed, a harsh, grating sound, soaked in the absolute certainty of his manufactured triumph. Deputy Hobbs exhaled a long, heavy breath, something close to genuine pity, and took a tentative step toward me. "Mr. Pruitt," he said, his tone dropping into that overly careful, patronizing register people reserve for the very old. "I am truly sorry, sir, but the court order is legally binding. Crane Holdings holds the deed to this property now. I need you to collect your things and vacate the premises. If you require medical transport to a care facility, I can arrange an ambulance." His hand lifted and hovered in the space between us, ready to guide me off the only home I had left. He was nothing but a pawn, a local officer completely blind to the fact that he had just walked onto the scene of a massive federal crime. I did not move. I did not shake. I did not clutch my chest and perform the frail old man. The crumbling, pitiful figure they had all counted on vanished entirely. I pulled my shoulders back, straightened my spine, and held the deputy's gaze without flinching. The shift was immediate. His hovering hand dropped slowly to his side, and the pity drained from his face, replaced by a sharp, wary confusion. "Officer Stubbs," I said, my voice carrying the cold, steady authority that had commanded deep-water drilling rigs for over 30 years. "Before you execute that document, before you make the single biggest, most catastrophic professional mistake of your entire law enforcement career, I want you to hear exactly what my loving daughter said last night." I reached into my trouser pocket and drew out my smartphone. No fumbling. My hands were perfectly still. I tapped the screen once, opening the secure audio file pulled directly from the micro recorder I'd hidden inside Nadia's designer purse. Resting on the thick wooden porch railing nestled among the potted ferns was a heavy-duty Bluetooth speaker I had bought specifically for this moment, a unit built to project sound over the roar of heavy machinery. I engaged the wireless connection. The speaker answered with a low bass chime. I glanced toward the street. Leland had stopped leaning on the horn, that arrogant smile wavering slightly as he watched the odd delay unfolding on my porch. I pushed the volume bar to its absolute limit and pressed play. The crystal-clear audio burst from the speaker like a thunderclap, rolling across the quiet suburban street and slamming against the brick faces of the neighboring homes. Nadia's voice, recorded just hours earlier inside their townhouse, rang out in the morning air, vibrating with greedy, breathless excitement. "Leland, you have to call the bank manager first thing tomorrow morning." Her voice boomed, undeniable. "We need to push through the second wire transfer before the old fool even realizes he's been locked out of his own accounts." The sound was so loud, so utterly impossible to dismiss, that Deputy Hobbs physically recoiled, stepping back and dropping his hand toward his utility belt. Across the street, the silver Porsche sat completely motionless, the driver frozen behind the wheel. The recording pressed on without mercy. Leland's voice joined the broadcast, his boastful, arrogant tone now playing for the entire neighborhood and for a uniformed officer of the law. "Don't give the bank a second thought, baby." Leland's recorded voice echoed across the lawn. "The collateral is locked up tight. That idiot signed the quitclaim deed without reading a single word of the fine print. He swallowed the tax management story whole. We just secured a $2.5 million federal commercial loan against a ghost asset, and the best part, he still thinks he owns the ground under his feet." The speaker carried the sound of crystal glasses meeting in a toast, a sickening clink celebrating my engineered ruin. "We flatten the place Monday." Leland's voice sneered out into the morning. "The federal funds will be fully offshore by Tuesday afternoon." I stood perfectly still and watched the color evacuate Deputy Hobbs's face. He was no fool. He was a sworn officer of the law, and he was standing there holding an eviction notice built on the exact fraudulent transaction being openly described in high-definition audio. The young deputy stared down at the manila folder in his hands, then looked back up at me, eyes wide with a sudden terrible understanding. The paper he was holding wasn't a legal mandate. It was the physical instrument of a coordinated federal bank fraud. The patronizing sympathy was gone, entirely replaced by the sharp, locked-in focus of a cop who had just stumbled into something enormous. He reached up slowly and unclipped the radio mic from his shoulder, his eyes cutting toward the silver Porsche. Across the street, the full weight of the situation had finally crashed down on Leland. Every trace of the smug, victorious grin had left his pale face, replaced by a pathetic mask of raw, uncut terror. He understood exactly what that pristine audio meant for his immediate future. He knew his bulletproof corporate heist had just been played in full for a uniformed officer standing 20 feet away. There was nowhere left to run, no deceit left to cover, no manufactured tears to cry his way out of federal prison. He slammed his trembling hand against the gear shift, throwing the car violently into drive. The engine roared, and the tires screamed against the hot asphalt as he made his desperate bid to flee. But he was far too late. The trap I had spent months building had already snapped shut around him. The speaker on my porch wasn't finished. The digital file moved without pause from their arrogant financial boasting into something far darker. The sound quality remained flawless, capturing even the subtle acoustics of their upscale townhouse. Nadia's voice sliced through the heavy morning air, crisp, calculated, and chillingly cold. "Once the sheriff hauls him out, drop him in that cheap state facility." Her voice echoed against the surrounding brick walls. "Make sure his premium heart medication gets canceled. He's 70, Leland. Without the good meds, his heart gives out in a month. We keep the $2.5 million the developers knock down the house, and we walk away free." The sheer malice of those words hung suspended in the air, strangling the quiet of the neighborhood in an instant. Front doors began to open. Neighbors drifted out onto their lawns, morning routines, abandoned faces turning toward my property in stunned silence. A daughter's cold, casual plotting of her own father's death had been broadcast for every soul on the street to hear. On my porch, Deputy Hobbs stood motionless, his eyes locked on the Bluetooth speaker tucked among the ferns. The manila envelope slipped from his loosened fingers, papers scattering across the floorboards. He was no longer looking at a confused, senile old man resisting a property transfer. He was face to face with the intended victim of a premeditated, cold-blooded murder conspiracy. The young officer swallowed hard, his throat working as his professional training overrode the initial shock. His right hand dropped instinctively to the radio on his tactical belt, fingers closing around it. He did not need to ask me a single question. The evidence had spoken for itself. Across the street, the silver Porsche's roaring engine went abruptly silent. In his blind panic to throw the car into gear and escape the wreckage of his own making, Leland had badly miscalculated. His arm knocked hard against the large, insulated coffee cup sitting in the center console. I watched with deep, cold satisfaction as the dark liquid splashed heavily across his lap and the spotless, expensive leather interior. He fumbled the cup loose, the rest of its contents flooding over the passenger seat. But Leland made no move to clean it. He sat entirely frozen behind the wheel, knuckles blanching as he strangled the leather eyes jerking frantically toward the officer standing on my porch. Nadia had just stepped out from the passenger side. The arrogant, victorious smirk she'd been wearing only moments before was wiped from her face permanently, as her own recorded voice laid out the precise method she intended to use to end my life. Every drop of color left her. The carefully applied makeup suddenly resembled a tragic mask. The suffocating terror of total exposure seized her completely. A trembling hand rose to her mouth, her eyes wide and locked on mine. She knew the illusion was gone. She knew that I knew everything. There were no more lies to construct, no fresh tears to manufacture, no further performances left to give. I looked down from the elevated position of my porch and observed the complete, utter ruin of the two people who had planned to put me in the ground. For months they had handled me like a disposable inconvenience, an expiring liability standing between them and an enormous financial windfall. They had turned my grief over my late wife into a weapon. They had leveraged my love as a father to steal the only sanctuary I had left. And when that still wasn't enough, they had calmly worked out the schedule of my physical death. Hearing those words out loud, confirming the darkest, most unforgivable reach of their greed, should have shattered me completely. Instead, it hardened my resolve into something close to iron. I stepped carefully around the scattered eviction papers on the porch floorboards and moved to the edge of the railing. I fixed my eyes on Nadia. I did not raise my voice. I did not betray a flicker of anger. I gave her nothing but the hollow, vacant stare of a man who had cut every last emotional thread. The street around us had gone entirely silent, broken only by the soft, static crackle of Deputy Hobbs's shoulder radio as he prepared to call for backup. The morning sun continued its climb, throwing long, clean shadows across the dew-soaked grass, illuminating the precise moment the predators became the prey. "Officer," I said, my eyes still fixed on my daughter, "I believe you now have more than sufficient probable cause to proceed with an arrest conspiracy to commit murder alongside the federal wire fraud and aggravated bank fraud they have already carried out using a forged quitclaim deed." Deputy Hobbs didn't hesitate. He pressed the transmit button, his voice sharp and stripped entirely of the patronizing softness it had held minutes before. "Dispatch, this is Unit 4. I need immediate backup at my current location. Priority 1. We have a confirmed 109 in progress. Suspect vehicle is a silver Porsche directly across from the target residence. Do not let that vehicle leave the perimeter." Leland clawed at the ignition key in a frenzy, desperate to get the stalled car restarted, but his hands were shaking so badly he could barely close his fingers around it. Nadia remained rooted to the concrete driveway, her knees dipping slightly as the distant rising wail of approaching sirens cut through the morning air. The carefully built fortress of their corporate theft was caving in around them in real time. They had been convinced the plan was airtight. They had assumed my age made me a compliant and easy mark. They had completely forgotten that an engineer spends his entire career anticipating structural failure and constructing inescapable traps for anyone who tries to circumvent the rules. The real elegance of the trap wasn't just the audio recording. It was the absolute futility of their underlying crime. Even if they had somehow cleared the driveway, even if they had managed to outrun the local police and the federal indictments bearing down on them, they still owned nothing at all. The irrevocable blind trust I had put in place years earlier meant the quitclaim deed they had so painstakingly forged was worthless paper. The $2.5 million they'd pulled from the federal bank was secured against an asset that didn't exist. They had gambled their freedom, their futures, and their entire lives for a property they could never lawfully hold. The demolition crew would never show up. The luxury retail center would never break ground. I watched the first black and white patrol cruiser swing around the corner, emergency lights strobing brilliantly against the quiet neighborhood homes. It accelerated hard, angling in sharply to seal the silver Porsche from the street. 2 more cruisers materialized within seconds, boxing the vehicle from every side. Uniformed officers poured out, hands resting carefully on holstered weapons. Deputy Hobbs came down my porch steps at a purposeful jog, moving toward the driveway where Nadia stood paralyzed, and Leland sat trapped inside his ruined car. I reached over and hit the power button on the Bluetooth speaker, cutting the sound. The air was now filled with the sharp, commanding noise of law enforcement, taking full control of the scene. I turned my back on the flashing lights, the shouting officers, and the panicked sobs of the woman who used to be my daughter. I walked inside and eased the heavy mahogany door shut behind me. For a few seconds I stood in the quiet hallway, feeling the full weight of justice settling over my home. The red and blue lights pulsed through the frosted glass of the entryway, throwing long, frantic shadows across the walls of my sanctuary. I had intended to let the authorities handle what remained to wash my hands of the 2 people who had conspired to take my life. But the cold, methodical engineer in my mind demanded one final definitive closure. A system is not fully decommissioned until the last valve is closed and the pressure is permanently bled out. I gripped the brass handle, pulled the heavy door open once more, and stepped back onto the front porch. The thick Georgia humidity rolled over me as I descended the 3 wooden steps, my boots striking the concrete walkway in a slow, deliberate rhythm. I did not shout. I did not shed a single tear. My breathing was perfectly even, my pulse carrying the steady, unyielding beat of a man who had fully reclaimed what was his. I crossed the street through the sea of flashing cruisers with the quiet authority of a ghost walking back from the grave. The entire neighborhood had stopped. People stood on their lawns in mourning robes, watching in stunned silence as the wealthy, arrogant couple from the city was systematically taken apart. Leland was pressed hard against the hood of his ruined car, wrists locked behind him in heavy steel cuffs, face flat against the hot metal eyes, wild and darting like a cornered animal. He was sweating through his clothes, the dark coffee stains bleeding into the fine fabric of his tailored trousers. But I didn't look at Leland. My gaze was fixed entirely on Nadia. She stood near the edge of the driveway, trembling so severely that her knees threatened to go out from under her. A female officer stood close beside her, gripping her upper arm firmly to keep her from sinking to the concrete. Nadia looked at me, eyes wide, silently pleading, searching for the merciful, forgiving father she had spent years exploiting. She expected me to step in, to call off the officers, to pull her back from the edge of the consequences she had built for herself. I stopped exactly 3 feet from her. The air between us felt dense, charged, as though a storm were passing through the space where our relationship used to be. I looked at the woman I had raised, the child I had held when she cried, the daughter I had loved with every fiber I possessed. I searched her face for any trace of my late wife and found absolutely nothing there. She was hollow, entirely hollowed out by a greed that had no floor. "You didn't just try to take my home, Nadia," I said. My voice was dangerously calm, perfectly level, carrying clearly over the crackle of the police radios around us. A fresh wave of tears broke over her lashes, cutting through her ruined makeup in dark streaks. I did not offer her a tissue. I did not reach out a hand. "You signed my death warrant for a couple of $1 million. The words landed on her like blows, one after another. You casually planned to murder your own father by deliberately cutting off my medication. You sat in my home, drank my tea, and calculated exactly how many days my heart would hold out without those premium prescriptions. You thought you could dump me in a cheap state facility, wait for me to quietly expire and walk away completely free. A soft, choked sob broke from her lips. She tried to speak, tried to pull together some version of a lie, but her throat had seized completely under the suffocating weight of my total awareness. Across the hood of the Porsche, Leland had begun thrashing weakly against the officer's grip, shouting garbled, desperate excuses, something about a misunderstanding about corporate restructuring, about temporary liquidations. I turned my head slowly and held his eyes. The pathetic, unraveling panic on his face was the final confirmation that every decision I had made was correct. Leland, you always believed you were the smartest person in any room, I said, raising my voice just enough that the arresting officers caught every word. You thought I was nothing but a senile, oblivious old man who blindly put his name on a quit-claim deed. You believed you had successfully cut me off from my own property, but you never bothered to run a basic title search. The color evacuated his face entirely, leaving his skin a pale, sickly gray. The struggling stopped. His chest hitched. Then I established an irrevocable blind trust in 2017. I continued watching with deep satisfaction as the life seemed to drain out of both of them. The property belongs entirely to that trust managed by an independent fiduciary. My personal signature holds no legal authority to transfer ownership. I cannot deed away an asset I don't legally control. The document you filed is nothing but a ghost on paper. The devastating truth of their position hit them like a wall of solid concrete. Their entire criminal architecture had been built on a lie from the very foundation. I moved slightly closer to Leland, lowering my voice to a level that forced him to listen. Do you understand what that means for your commercial loan, Leland? I asked almost gently. You walked into a federally insured bank and used a void, entirely fabricated document to pull a $2.5 million wire transfer. You pledged as collateral an asset you can never legally own. The money sitting in your offshore account is completely unsecured. The bank holds no actual lien against this property. You didn't just run a family con. You committed massive, undeniable federal wire fraud and aggravated bank fraud. The crushing weight of those words settled over the humid morning air. Leland's legs gave out, his knees buckled, and he slumped hard against the side of the cruiser, kept upright only by the officers gripping his arms. Nadia buried her face in her hands and released a loud, agonizing wail of pure, unadulterated despair. I had deliberately let them proceed with the fraudulent eviction, allowed them to walk their forged documents directly in front of local law enforcement, guaranteeing the federal authorities an airtight, irrefutable record of willful criminal intent. I stood in the bright Georgia sunlight, a lone wolf who had defended his sanctuary, and one watching quietly as the police cruisers began carrying what remained of my broken family away. The neighborhood stood hushed and still, bearing witness to the absolute ruin of two people who had so recklessly tried to destroy mine. The local cruisers had barely finished securing the perimeter when the true scale of my retaliation arrived. Before Leland could make any final desperate lunge toward the open door of his silver Porsche, before he could try one last time to slip Deputy Hobbs's grasp, the deep, guttural roar of heavy, high-performance engines tore the morning silence wide open. 3 massive, all-black, unmarked SUVs screamed around the corner of the suburban street, shredding through the quiet residential calm. Their thick tires shrieked and smoked against the asphalt as they executed a perfectly synchronized tactical blockade, forming an impenetrable wall of dark steel and tinted glass that sealed off the street, completely trapping Leland and Nadia inside a federal net. The doors flew open in unison. A dozen heavily armed federal agents stepped out into the thick Georgia humidity, moving with a terrifying, silent efficiency, boots striking the ground in lockstep dark tactical vests emblazoned with the bold yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The sharp bite of burned rubber drifted across the manicured lawns, swallowing the last traces of morning dew. Leading the federal detachment was Sterling Caffrey. My seasoned litigation attorney stepped from the lead vehicle, his immaculate suit, a sharp contrast against the tactical gear surrounding him. He straightened his tie, looked up toward my porch, and gave me one single crisp nod. The elaborate trap we had built together in his downtown office had sprung exactly as designed. 2 federal agents moved directly on Leland. The local deputies stepped back without a word of protest, ceding jurisdiction to the federal presence without hesitation. Leland let out a high-pitched, pathetic sound of raw panic as the agents took him firmly by the shoulders. He tried to squirm free, his expensive Italian loafers skidding wildly across the wet concrete where his spilled coffee had pooled. He was spun hard and driven face-first against the hood of his own Porsche. The impact left a deep, ugly dent in the pristine custom bodywork, a fitting, almost poetic symbol of the sudden demolition of his carefully constructed life. Leland Crane, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit federal bank fraud, aggravated wire fraud, and attempted extortion of a federally insured financial institution. The lead agent's voice boomed with absolute authority as he began reciting the Miranda warnings. The cold, metallic snap of federal handcuffs closing around Leland's wrists rang out clearly across the silent street. Leland pressed his cheek against the hot metal of his ruined sports car, eyes wide and utterly vacant, finally absorbing the certainty that his life as he had known it was finished. He was no longer a wealthy corporate executive holding a fraudulent deed. He was a federal defendant headed for a maximum security facility. Nadia stood frozen at the edge of the driveway, watching the complete annihilation of her husband and her stolen future unfold in front of her. The federal agents had no intention of overlooking her role in the conspiracy. A tall, severe female agent approached, drawing a second pair of heavy steel handcuffs from her tactical belt. The sight of those restraints finally shattered whatever remained of Nadia's composure. The cold, calculating predator who had mapped out my death so calmly just hours before simply ceased to exist. She collapsed, her knees cracking hard against the rough asphalt with a sickening impact that split the fabric of her expensive designer trousers. The suffocating reality of her new, inescapable situation swallowed her whole. She began sobbing hysterically, a raw, ugly sound clawing its way out of her throat, and looked up at me standing firm on the elevated porch. "Daddy, please!" She screamed, her voice fracturing with wild desperation that carried the length of the block, drawing the horrified stares of dozens of neighbors who had come to their doors. "Please, you have to stop them right now. Tell them it's a mistake. I am your daughter. I am your little girl. Please don't let them take me away." Her expensive makeup was smeared in dark, ruined streaks across her pale face. She stretched her trembling hands toward me, grasping at the empty air between us, begging for the paternal mercy she had so deliberately exploited and discarded. She expected the man who had spent his entire life protecting her to step down off that porch and shield her from the consequences of what she had done. I did not move a single step. I did not soften my posture by 1 degree, and I offered her nothing, not a word of comfort, not a gesture of reassurance. I looked down at her from my reclaimed sanctuary with a face of absolute, complete stillness. The generous father she had once known, the vulnerable older man she had counted on manipulating and eventually disposing of in a state facility, was gone. Permanently. I held her pleading, terrified gaze and felt nothing inside but a profound cold and final emptiness. My little girl died the exact moment she decided my life was worth less than a luxury vacation and a beachfront property. I said, my voice carrying across the lawn, perfectly flat, perfectly cold, bearing the inescapable weight of a final judgment. "Enjoy your new life in federal prison." The words hit her like a physical blow. She gasped, her mouth dropping open, as the female agent took firm hold of her arms and wrenched them behind her back. The steel cuffs snapped into place, locking my daughter in the cold, unyielding grip of federal justice. I did not stay to watch the remainder of that miserable scene play out in my driveway. I turned my back on the flashing lights, the armed agents, and the pathetic fading screams of the woman who had tried to put me in the ground. I walked slowly across the porch planks, my boots moving over the scattered, worthless eviction papers that had drifted across the floorboards like dry leaves in the wind. I took hold of the heavy brass handle, pushed back into the cool quiet of my home, and drew the heavy mahogany door firmly shut behind me. The deadbolt turned with a deep, satisfying click, locking all of it out. The roar and chaos of the street was instantly swallowed by the profound, settled silence of a house that belonged to no one but me. I moved with steady, deliberate steps toward the warmth of my private study, leaving the wreckage of their betrayal behind me without a backward glance.